Hello and welcome to the esteemed members of the grading panel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm able to be presenting my case study defense to you. Basically, this explainer serves as a comprehensive life cycle analysis of a truly, absolutely crucial piece of international infrastructure. We're going to rigorously examine not just the physical nuts and bolts of the asset itself, but also the complex political and financial mechanisms that actually brought the whole shebang into existence. So welcome to the explainer. Today, we're deconstructing the Coral Sea Cable System, which is commonly known in the industry as CS squared. For this defense, my analysis rests on three core pillars: network engineering, geopolitical procurement, and risk architecture. And we're looking at all of this within the context of the increasingly strategic Southwest Pacific region. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're going to put the pieces together. Okay, let's dive right into this. Our roadmap today follows four distinct academic themes. First, context and geopolitical pivot. Second, CS2 network architecture. Third, governance and project execution. And finally, capacity, risk, and strategy. Starting us off with Section 1, context and geopolitical pivot. This was the true catalyst for connectivity in the region. But before we can really evaluate the connectivity gap, we need to establish our technical baseline. So let's define our primary metric, round-trip time, or RTT. Academically speaking, RTT is the duration, measured in milliseconds, that it takes for a data packet to travel from its source to a destination and then back again. In the world of modern telecommunications, minimizing RTT isn't just a nice-to-have, it's an absolute engineering imperative. You literally need it for seamless video calls and highly interactive cloud services to even function properly. So, what was the situation on the ground? Historically, the Southwest Pacific faced a pretty stark problem-solution dynamic. Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were totally reliant on geosynchronous satellites, orbiting 36,000 kilometers up in space. This created a severely constrained environment, with an RTT of roughly 500 milliseconds, which is incredibly slow for modern needs. The solution? The deployment of the Coral Sea Cable. This established a 4,700-kilometer direct undersea route. It engineered a staggering 6,000-fold step change in available bandwidth and absolutely slashed RTT down to sub-50 milliseconds. It fundamentally unlocked direct peering to global cloud networks. Now, you might be wondering how a project like this gets off the ground. Well, the procurement of this asset was anything but standard. Originally, it was planned as a commercial, single-owner build supplied by Huawei Marine Networks and backed by private finance. But then came a massive geopolitical pivot. The Australian government intervened, citing the telecommunications sector's security reforms, or TSSR. This intervention completely restructured the project. It was effectively re-tendered inside a trilateral memorandum of understanding to guarantee digital sovereignty and supplier diversity. The end result was a grant-funded trilateral special-purpose vehicle with Vocus Communications stepping in as the prime contractor. This is an objective, textbook example of how geopolitics can fundamentally alter infrastructure procurement. All right, moving right along to Section 2, CS2 network architecture. Let's look at the physical infrastructure and telemetry to prove the engineering competence behind all of this. Looking at the project's parameters, we're talking about some serious scale. It's a 4,700-kilometer international system connecting Sydney to both Port Moresby and Honiara via a branching unit. The system boasts a massive aggregate capacity of up to 40 terabits per second. It achieves this by leveraging 100G dense wavelengths division multiplexing, or DWDM, operating right in the C-band. And remarkably, this entire technological stack was delivered with an approximate total budget of 200 million Australian dollars, with commercial operations kicking off in February 2020. To fully grasp this architecture, we have to compartmentalize the infrastructure into two totally distinct environments: the wet plant and the dry plant. The wet plant, which was supplied by Alcatel's submarine networks, is exactly what it sounds like. It's in the ocean. It includes the armored fiber, the C-band optical repeaters spaced every 70 to 100 kilometers, and the high-voltage power feed equipment. In contrast, the dry plant is the shore-based infrastructure, specifically the ASN 1620 soft node submarine line terminal equipment, or SLTE. This is where the submerged fiber integrates with the terrestrial core routers in Sydney, Port Moresby, and Honiara. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the Y-shaped trunk anatomy. The main trunk leaving Sydney contains 8 fibers, or 4 fiber pairs. Then, at the 2,500-kilometer mark, it splits. 2 pairs route to Port Moresby, and 2 pairs route over to Honiara. Splitting the fibers exactly 4 and 4 guarantees that both nations receive an equal 20 terabits per second of design capacity. But more importantly, this anatomy provides absolutely critical fault isolation. A physical cut on the Port Moresby arm will not interrupt data transmission on the Honiara arm, and power feeds can be independently re-energized. It's brilliant engineering. The final piece of the architectural puzzle here is the routing strategy. The system terminates at the Telstra-Paddington Exchange down in Sydney. Why Sydney? Because it acts as the peering gravity center for the entire region. By landing in Sydney, the network design guarantees that traffic from Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands takes the absolute shortest possible IP-level path to major hyperscalers like AWS, Google, and Microsoft. Plus, it provides the fastest route to broader US and Asian destinations. This architectural decision is what ultimately drives end-user latency down to that propagation-limited minimum we discussed earlier. Transitioning now into Section 3, Governance and Project Execution. Let's explore how you actually manage a trilateral build of this magnitude. First, let's briefly look at the macro schedule. Normally, a standard submarine cable life cycle follows 4 main phases spanning roughly 3 years. You've got concept and planning, regulatory and marine survey, procurement and manufacturing, and finally, commissioning. However, the Coral Sea cable experienced a highly unique temporal distortion in this front-end schedule. In practice, that distortion created a split-paced engineering lifecycle. Driven by that sudden geopolitical pivot we mentioned and the TSSR security tests, the entire front-end, concept planning, marine survey, and regulatory approvals was heavily compressed into a tight 24-month window. This was a purely politically accelerated phase. Conversely, once the contract was finalized, the back-end phases executed by Vocus and ASN followed conventional industry timelines. They achieved a textbook installation and a flawless 4-step commissioning process exactly on schedule. To execute all of this, a very specific legal structure was required: the Special Purpose Vehicle, or SPV. In corporate finance, an SPV is just a subsidiary created to isolate financial risk. But for this project, it was utilized not just for risk isolation, but to actually create a neutral, legally binding entity for trilateral joint ownership among Australia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. Let's break down how this trilateral governance flows, because it is seamless. The Australian government, via DFAT, provided a $136.6 million official development assistance grant to Vocus. Meanwhile, the recipient nations provided the remaining capital for their local landing stations. Sitting right at the center is the SPV, the Coral Sea Cable Company. The brilliance of this structure is that the SPV grants indefeasible rights of use, or IRU, to the local telcos for the entire 25-year design life of the cable. This ensures the asset is trilaterally managed, but, and this is key, crucial retail pricing decisions remain strictly onshore and under the control of the sovereign nations. So the crucial point is that we are witnessing an inverse leverage model of diplomacy here. While Australia provided 66.7% of the total project funding, it deliberately took only 33.3% equity in the SPV and just one single board seat. By limiting its own operational leverage after the system was ready for service, the donor nation prioritized long-term regional stability over direct control. The wet plant, from an engineering perspective, is the easy part. It's the governance that is the true achievement here. Which brings me to the core thesis of my analysis that I proudly present to the grading panel today. Donor aid and small state digital sovereignty can successfully coexist. The governance framework of the Coral Sea Cable definitively proves this can happen inside an industry-standard procurement frame. Moving into our final evaluation phase, Section 4, Capacity, Risk, and Strategy. Let's look at the forward-looking imperatives. Let's examine capacity. Currently, only a fraction of the system's latent capacity is actually lit, just 200 gigabits per second at activation. However, there is a massive 20 terabit per second headroom per country. Because data traffic is growing at up to 45% year-on-year, an SLTE refresh window is estimated between 2026 and 2028. The strategic advantage here is that operators can unlock this massive headroom using purely dry plant interventions. By simply swapping out the 100G line cards for 400G coherent cards in the shore stations, they can push lit capacity past 1 terabit per second without ever needing to touch the expensive submerged wet plant. However, looking at the spatial distribution of risk, we have to acknowledge that operational resilience is not absolute. I've mapped vulnerabilities from R1, like anchor damage and shelf approaches, all the way to R6, which includes cyber threats at landing stations. And this brilliantly illustrates our biggest concern, drawing the panel's attention to R7, the highest exposure risk on the entire route. Despite this massive bandwidth upgrade, both Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands remain single-table countries internationally. A serious fault on their respective arms still delivers a near-total international internet outage. It's a huge vulnerability. Therefore, my case study concludes with 3 forward-looking strategic imperatives. First, operators must secure the upgrade path right now by publishing a multi-year SLTE refresh roadmap to lock in budget cycles ahead of the 2028 demand peaks. Second, they absolutely must mitigate that R7 concentration risk we just talked about. The only true mitigation is building a second, geographically diverse cable, perhaps an eastward route connecting to Vanuatu or Fiji to create a resilient Pacific ring. Third, the industry should codify this governance template globally. The equal shareholder SVV combined with IRU-based commercial rights is just a highly successful model. I will conclude my academic defense by leaving the grading panel with this final, provocative thought. As we look at the global landscape of telecommunications, we really must ask, will the Coral Sea Cable's inverse leverage model redefine the future standard for infrastructure diplomacy in contested geopolitical zones? Thank you so much for your time, your attention, and your rigorous evaluation of this case study today.